My name is Jane McKay. I've spent time as a kid all over the countryside traveling with my dad, who was military, and he was stationed different places. I brought in 2 original copies of flyers that were dropped in the first operation of Operation Torch, North Africa in 1942.
Gibraltar has been a strategic stronghold for the British since the 1700s. Jutting out from the southern tip of Spain, its 400-metre tall limestone cliffs stare across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar to the African continent. During World War II, Gibraltar controlled virtually all naval traffic travelling between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. By mid-war, more than 30,000 British soldiers, sailors and airmen were stationed at Gibraltar. Within the limestone rock, they created an underground city, including more than 50 kilometers of tunnels and a fully equipped hospital. It was here at Gibraltar that the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the Allied invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch.
Well, I'd like to welcome Jan again to our segment here.
Thank you.
What we have here is I would say, a very historic item, and probably the only one of its type. This is the squadron crest for 233 Squadron, which was an RAF squadron, which your father was attached to.
Mm-hmm. His name was Everett Badu. He was always known as Shan through his Air Force career. Other people mostly didn't even know his name was Everett.
These are individual signatures of everyone on the squadron?
This is signatures of squadron members at Gibraltar in 1942.
And the Latin "strong and faithful" is the motto of the squadron.
General Eisenhower was on Gibraltar. He was commanding the invasion of North Africa, which Operation Torch was the beginning of.
233 Squadron was tasked with a leaflet dropping operation.
He had these that are part of the original thing. They're not copies, because when he landed back at Gibraltar, a couple of them had stuck to the side of the fuselage, and he retrieved them.
So they weren't deployed fully.
Yes, he missed 2. My father was the squadron leader, and they were tasked with flying over 3 cities, towns in North Africa on the early mornings for 6 o'clock in the morning of Operation Torch, which was November 1942. And it was to let the civilians know primarily that they weren't going to be attacking civilians, but there was going to be a landing of troops on an invasion of North Africa. The Vichy French primarily were who was there. And so from Gibraltar, they flew in to coordinate with the attack in the morning.
These are very high quality made leaflets that were dropped.
He thinks they were printed in the States, and I looked at them once and thought, well, this is all says about the Americans, but there's British and Canadians, and British were a large part of that force, and I thought, this is a little one-sided, but it was purposeful. The relationship between the French and the British was quite tense, so they were highlighting the Americans' involvement because there was a better relationship between the French and the Americans.
Operation Torch, which Champidou was involved in, was the first American-led operation that was the Free French territories as well. And the Free French had amassed the remembrance of the French Navy at Oran, and that was part of that force that the Americans and the Allies were particularly concerned about. It was also a stepping stone that led to the Italian invasion of Sicily and ultimately the Italian mainland, which was a major contributor to the end of the Mediterranean War. The Gibraltar part of your father's operational career was just a small part of a very varied and interesting military career.
Always wanted to fly. His dad took him to Pictou Harbor one time when he was a young child and saw the American flying boats who were coming around on a tour to show off their airplanes, and he decided that's what he was going to do.
He started when he was 17 years old in Trenton, Nova Scotia.
So he did his private pilot's license. I think a little unusual in those days, but he always wanted to fly from when he was a kid. That's what he said anyway. Well, he was accepted into our CAF in 1938, but there was a year-long queue, right, to get into training and things, because I think people were thinking that things were on the horizon. But the British had a program that they were accepting people from the Commonwealth to go into pilot training in the UK. So he wound up going to Scotland and training in the RAF there. I think he went overseas in early 39 or 38, before war had been declared anyway, and started training as a pilot there. He transferred back to the Canadian Air Force after the war. He did test work on the CF-100, first person to fly a jet in Canada. So he had a fairly long, interesting military career. and retired as a commanding officer at Greenwood in 1968.
So 223 ended up in Gibraltar.
Largely their responsibility was to keep communication and supplies going to Malta, but it was the only other piece of territory in all of Europe, North Africa, whatever, controlled by the Allies. Dad said there were more ships and people lost in those convoys to Malta than there were in the North Atlantic ones from Halifax. They weren't talking about it a lot because it was quite depressing. Statistically, his survival in the war for the number of hours he flew and how many people were lost and whatever, I think he was a little unusual. I think an illustration of how dangerous it could be. I mean, you're flying leaflets over this place, and does that seem really dangerous? But they were at 1,000 feet, right? Otherwise, the leaflets were going to be like gone halfway across the Atlantic or something likely, right? And they're anti-aircraft guns, but 5 aircraft on this expedition went out, and only 3 came back. A lot were lost.
So Jane, we've got these great items here. The long-term, I guess, preservation of these artifacts and the story they tell is something that my particular museum does, telling the story of a Nova Scotia boy that went out and did some pretty incredible things and had a pretty incredible career. Would you be open to loaning items?
I think the short answer is yes. It needs to go somewhere where people preserve it and understand it.
The story of Chambadou is one that most people probably don't know. And Jane, in a sense, she's carrying that last torch of that remembrance.
Keeping all of this stuff in the story going, whatever is difficult, I think it should go on somewhere where we can keep telling these stories. We need to learn and understand things from the past, so it'd be better in a more public venue. And we have the book that my dad wrote, The Wedge in the Door, about his time in Gibraltar.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, for bringing these particular items.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. The stories get lost if we don't tell them.